there. We have 1 week left for our 24 days of tea because today is December 17th. So here we have more of those same colored boxes. And today's tea is, it's upside down, the Organic David's Breakfast Blend. So looking right in there, it's dark. Most breakfast blend teas are actually going to be dark because they are actually a black tea blend of some kind. So we actually have some black tea, which I, of course, as you know, am excited about because I like black tea. Now, this particular tea, being black tea, is going to have 3 out of 3 pips as far as caffeine goes. So if you are sensitive to caffeine, definitely consider cutting this with some other ingredients like milk, a little bit of sugar, that kind of thing. And definitely avoid drinking this later at night. So that's one warning there. This tea will steep at 95 degrees Celsius for 3 to 5 minutes, which is a nice typical length of time for a good black tea. The ingredients in this particular blend are organic black tea from Assam, India, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka. So again, pretty simple, straightforward, a little bit like that green tea jasmine one that I had, a little bit like the chamomile, but just like both those videos, I have plenty to say about black tea. So we're gonna go ahead and give this guy a smell, look at it under the ingredients and under the ingredients camera, and we'll go ahead and start seeing what we can do. I mean, the obvious thing to say is that it smells like tea, but if you're looking for specific notes, it's a little sweeter than I think a lot of black teas are. And I'm getting maybe some sort of floral note in there at the very end of it, which again makes sense because a lot of tea plants actually do flower, so it would make sense that I'm getting that. This guy is pretty finely grained, which you can see as I'm pouring out here. And you're not going to see much different when I actually pop it over to the ingredient cam. It's just a nice blend of black tea. You can kind of see some lighter colors mixed in with that. That's probably either tea that was not fully dried and fermented, or and oxidized, or else it might actually be parts of the tea flower itself. So we're gonna try my much larger muslin bag, not because it needed to be this much larger, but because the other one that I made was obviously really, really dinky small. So I was like, oh, I'll just expand the dimensions a bit, and then somehow got really off on my calculations. So it's either comically small or comically large for my little tea bags, which, whatever. I'm not selling them or anything. I'm just using them so that I have a way to make tea. That's probably good. Maybe a little more. I like a good strong black tea, so I don't mind using more. Now, of course, breakfast blends do not have to be blended, drunk and consumed in the morning with breakfast. They can be consumed at any point in time. Again, in Britain, the traditional black tea that you actually get at your tea time is an English breakfast. And it's more just this idea of it being that kind of pick-up, perk sort of situation. So that's really what you're going for when you're getting your black tea fix on. All right. We're going to wrap the string around the top here so that way it doesn't sit so comically large in my teacup over there. Now, so starting with talking a little bit like I did with the jasmine tea and talking about the regions where the green tea in that particular blend came from. Assam is a state in northeastern India, and it has a population of over 31 million people. So it's a really populated province, and it's actually known for its wildlife, its archaeological sites, and the tea plantations and other plantations that are across the region. If you do go to Guwahati, which is the largest city in Assam, you can find silk bazaars and the Kamakhya temple. So those are some key tourist attractions for the region. People in Assam speak Assamese, which is an Indo-Aryan language, and it's actually the easternmost Indo-European language, and it has over 14 million speakers. So a note about the Indo-European language thing, English is actually also part of that Indo-European family of languages. A lot of languages that we see globally do come from that Indo-European language, and we can actually linguistically trace them back to a region in Turkey that's actually fairly close to Mount Ararat, which, if you know a little bit of biblical history, this is where a kind of cool overlap happens between what many people regard as myth, and the idea of mythos being this longevity and power of story, which is not a bad thing, which is where we get mythology from. And then there's the actual archaeological and linguistic evidence that traces this particular grouping of languages all the way back through their histories and development to that region in Anatolia. So that's kind of cool, all things considered. And if you can hear things in the background, I'm sorry, my husband just got home from doing some Christmas shopping, so he's listening to a YouTube video to occupy himself. Anyway, Indo-European languages obviously have a lot of things in common, which is why, for instance, you have the theories about Darth Vader being Dark Father because of the similarities to Dutch/German words and those kinds of things. My husband would actually lecture you this whole thing about it. He's a big Star Wars nerd. But regardless, we do have those kinds of commonalities linguistically. So the fact that this is the easternmost of that grouping of languages is actually pretty cool, because that shows you that then there's an entire other linguistic family, which is where we get our more Asiatic languages. So your Thai and Chinese, Japanese, those languages actually have their own other origin. And then basically the farthest you can go to get this major grouping of languages is Assam. So I think that's really cool. The other language they speak in Assam is Bengali, and Bengali is also part of that Indo-European language. That's a little interesting. Oh, other cool thing about the Indo-European language, the Proto-Indo-European language, what would have been the parent language of all these other languages, again, including English. It's actually thought that the Basque people in the mountains of Spain, it's thought that they actually are the last group of people that speak this Indo-European proto-language there. And that they, one of the reasons why they have such a pressure to try and raise people to speak that Basque language is because it's actually one of the oldest languages that we have globally remaining anymore. So that is, another real quick note. Assam tea, then, is a black tea, which I showed you here, and it specifically comes from the Camellia sinensis, which is all tea plants right there, but there's a specific variant, which is actually called the Assamica, and it's actually a specific tea plant that is indigenous to Assam, in part because efforts to plant the Chinese varieties of tea in Assam failed. The conditions were not quite right. It just did not thrive the way that they expected it to. And then they discovered that they had their own tea plant that grew there naturally. So they basically went, oh, well, we can do the same production just with a different variety of plant. Typically, if you're going to be in Assam producing tea, you're going to find that you're growing it at sea level, and the Assam tea is actually known for the body of flavor that it provides. It's described as somewhat malty, so that fermenting note is going to be a little bit more prominent in the Assam teas, and it is also supposed to produce a very strong color to the actual steep of the tea. So we're going to watch for that, and I'm going to put the water over the tea bag here shortly, since I do have quite a bit to say actually about these teas in these regions. Anyway, Assam tea you can actually find in a lot of different breakfast blends, including like an Irish breakfast blend, in part because it has that bold, brisk kind of flavor and actually has a pretty high caffeine content. So drinking it in the morning gives you that morning boost that's going to be somewhat equivalent to having a cup of coffee. But again, not everyone drinks coffee, which has its own other actual interesting history when I get to the next region from where this black tea and this blend comes from. Now, Assam is one of 2 regions in the world with native tea plants, the other being China. And the Assam tea bush actually did apparently make its way to Europe in conjunction with Robert Bruce in 1823. So it's thought he was out hanging around in India and saw the plant and was like, I'm gonna take that back. So he did, and then the plant made its way there. Now, naturally, the British East India Company identified a commercial potential for Assam tea in comparison to that Chinese ideal, because everything was measured off of that Chinese ideal of profile of flavor and body and everything, like the way that you would just go through and taste teas. And I have a tea journal that I have been sort of keeping up with for each of these teas. It's intense what tea connoisseurs actually have to go through to be certified as a tea expert. And so when you think about all those standards that come from that Chinese ideal, there was some definite resistance, you could say, towards introducing a new variety of tea, but also an opportunity to potentially have a secondary tea blend that they could market and sell that was then going to be cheaper for them to acquire and would still turn a major profit. So they actually were assessing the market for the Assam tea in London around the late 1830s, trying to see what did people think of it, did the flavor actually appeal, basically testing would it actually succeed. So it was interesting that there was market research that dates that far back. You don't really think about market research being such an old idea, but obviously it had to, and it had to be in some kind of regards, otherwise certain things would never have taken off. Now, positive feedback obviously did come around, and so it led to the process of some kind of shady things going on with that East India Company, wherein they did some different weird deals where they ended up seizing a lot of agricultural lands and forest commons through these wasteland acts, and that allowed them to take these lands and transform them into tea plantations, and that led to a very colonial-driven phrase and term called the planter raj. So basically, they came in as these kings, these rajas of these plantations of tea, and it's not a really flattering term at all, but a lot of the history associated with the East India Trading Company, at least the British one, is not flattering either. So, take it or leave it there, I guess. Now, interestingly, tea gardens in Assam actually have their own time zone. They're in the time zone that is called Bagan time. It's also what Myanmar uses as their MMT time zone. In Assam, it's also referred to as tea garden time, which is kind of precious and adorable, and I love everything about it. I want to live in tea garden time. Just basically makes me think that I live in a perpetual state of tea parties. Little Alice in Wonderlandy there, but tea. It's actually a full hour ahead of the India Standard Time, on which the rest of India and even actually Sri Lanka are on. So that then allows me to start preparing to transition into talking about the Ceylon and Sri Lankan tea there, but not yet. Assam tea is grown in the lowlands of Assam, but teas that you would know as Darjeelings or potentially the Nilgiris, they're actually grown in the highlands of that region. Different growing conditions, and thus, because of the different climates in those two regions, you're going to actually produce different flavors because of what happens in the leaves between their photosynthetic process. So it's just an interesting little thing there. Assam actually does have a long growing season, and it makes it the most prolific tea producing region in the world, basically. It yields every year 680.5 million kilos or 1,500 million pounds of tea. That's a lot of tea every single year, and it's hard to think of anyone that could really compete with that. Now, with Assam, this is actually another interesting thing. I think everything is interesting. I love learning. But there are actually two different harvests of Assam tea that occur. There's the first flush, which happens during the late March season, and then significantly later you have the second flush. And I didn't see exactly when that is, but what ends up happening, it's called tippy tea, and it's the more prized of the two flushes, the two harvests that you can get. And that's partly because this tea leaf ends up with this kind of golden tip, and that's how you know it's ready for that second flush. And this particular tippy tea ends up being sweeter, it's more full-bodied, and so it's actually considered the superior selection of the tea. So I am a little curious as to which of the harvests David's tea has. I would assume that the majority of blends aren't going to care as much. I think if you're probably going to be drinking straight Assam tea, you're going to tend to find a little bit more of the tippy tea available, but I obviously don't know. I haven't done my research as far as which one David's tea has or not. But Assam tea may boost immunity and heart and brain health, so it's actually good for you to drink tea. So I'm going to go ahead and get my water going. Now, as I'm pouring in the water here, you can already see that the heat of the water and that tea blend itself is creating and releasing already a golden, vibrant tea color. So I would assume that's part of the Assam tea highlight that we're looking for and for which the Assam is known. So now we're going to move on to that other region where this tea blend is coming from, and that's the Ceylon. And so what's interesting is the back of the box says Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And when I was doing the research, Ceylon actually isn't a city or even a region in Sri Lanka. It's the old name of Sri Lanka. So it's got an interesting, really complicated history. So I'm going to go pretty high level on this, just because that starts to get into a lot more of the issues of colonialism that I've sort of hinted at different points throughout this particular tea journey. And when I launch my new, bi-weekly or just weekly series, I haven't decided if it'll be 1 or 2 a week yet, but when I do that starting in January, I will have an opportunity to go a little bit more in depth. Not hugely, but a little bit more. So we're gonna save hopefully some of that information for later. But so as Ceylon, it was actually a British Crown colony, and that was between 1815 and 1948. From 1948 to 1972, they were an independent country that was part of the Commonwealth of Nations. That Commonwealth, of course, includes Australia, South Africa, the things that you think of as being, British without actually being in England, right? So it was part of that. And then in 1972, they were granted their full independence, and then they changed their name to Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, tea production accounts for 2% of GDP annually, and it employs actual hundreds of thousands of people. So it is a major industry for them, and they do definitely rely upon it. And those people work on tea plantations and the estates, and of course that ends up with some really negative sounding things when we talk about plantations. Not all plantations are associated with slavery. In the United States, they tend to be, but globally, not always the case. There's definitely going to be some shady things going on early on, especially when we're looking in the 1800s with that, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily slaves. Again, I don't actually know on this one. I didn't delve that deeply for reasons I've already mentioned. But Sri Lanka is the 4th largest producer of tea in the world, and up until 1995, they were actually the leading exporter of tea in the world. But they're still going to be up there if they're producing that much tea. So now, as I've noted in a couple of other videos, if you've been paying attention, before the tea industry came about in Sri Lanka, cinnamon was actually something that Ceylon was known for. Remember, I noted that the Dutch East India Company had control of the formerly Portuguese cinnamon trade in Ceylon. So cinnamon in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, trying to remember to call it Ceylon when I'm talking historically and Sri Lanka when I'm talking more current. But Ceylon, in that particular country, cinnamon was the first crop to receive government sponsorship, and they established cinnamon plantations in 1767, even though the Dutch did have control of that cinnamon production in 1638. Remember, I did mention that the Dutch started cultivating and really trying to refine the harvesting practices for cinnamon, and so once they figured that all out, it became a little bit more feasible to actually establish full-on plantations for cultivating cinnamon. Eventually, coffee was introduced into the region, and the coffee really took root there, grew really well. People became really interested in it. It was going to be this huge trade boon, all these kinds of things. Everyone was super focused on coffee, especially the British once they eventually took over Ceylon from the Dutch. So they're really focused on coffee up until the late 1870s, when a coffee blight pretty much wipes out almost all of their coffee trees that are there. And so when then people are like, well, we can switch our focus to tea, it's a little bit of a gamble. It seems kind of risky. It also seems like the inferior choice because they had been doing so well with coffee and everyone knew coffee. They didn't really know much about production of tea. Now, what's interesting about tea in Ceylon is that it was actually smuggled into the country from China by the British in 1824, and then this little plant was put into the Royal Botanical Gardens there, because again, remember, it was a British Crown colony up until 1948. So it was British territory, so they had the Royal Gardens. So they smuggled this plant in and planted there for non-commercial uses. They just had a tea plant because, they're all the rage or something along those lines. In 1839, more experimental tea plants ended up coming into Ceylon from Assam and from Calcutta, which are both in India. And then in 1867, a young man, he was 17 at the time when he arrived in Ceylon. His name is James Taylor, and he actually really started Ceylon's tea industry because he established the first tea estate or plantation in the Lulkandura estate, which is in the Kingdom of Kandy, which is now a major city in Sri Lanka, but it was a huge, massive kingdom. It made up a major political and geographical region of Ceylon historically. It's actually the last capital of the ancient kings. So it's got some serious cultural significance there. So it now is known actually for the tea production that James Taylor brought to them. Now, the original plantation that Taylor founded was actually only 19 acres in size. So pretty small by most plantation standards, but it really got going. In 1872, Taylor actually did have a fully functioning, fully equipped tea factory where he processed the leaves, dried them out, fermented them, oxidized them, the entire process to make the tea. And the first 23-pound shipment came of Ceylon tea in 1873 and went out to London. So you want to talk about test audiences and test markets. Can you imagine being one of those early drinkers of this Ceylon tea and thinking, and actually thinking that maybe it's a cheaper option? I have no idea how much it sold for or anything like that, but especially because we know that the Chinese tea was the ideal, the Assam became the alternative. What's this new tea variety on the market, right? Man, it's just got to be interesting, thinking about how we've really developed so much tea, just even based on growing regions. And actually, the Ceylon tea has a pretty unique growing region, which actually means that it's supposed to have citrus notes. It actually is also pretty low in caffeine, so there's something about the growing conditions that do not really lend themselves to producing or, encouraging the production of caffeine, and especially when you compare it to that Assam tea. But it is actually high in antioxidants and may actually help decrease risk factors for heart disease. So again, there's a lot more to Ceylon's history that's tied up with colonialism, which a lot of tea is actually going to be tied up with. But I don't want to get into that. My video is already too long here, so we're going to go ahead and check out the tea. So again, I've got a nice gradient going on, very light brown up at the top, and then a very dark, rich brown towards the bottom there. Okay. Disadvantage of trying to coil that cord around the bag is that I didn't have anything to grab onto. That swirled really easily, disrupting that gradient. Very, very rich, I would even say like a nice bold, stereotypical tea color. There is no doubt in my mind that you would see this and think, ah, yes, that is a cup of tea. Now, because of the color intensity, it's a little hard to make out the bottom of the cup. Fortunately, because I have a well-lit room, I can see where the bottom of the cup is catching that light underneath the liquid here, but it is a very, very saturated color here. And you can see how dark it is when I just move it out of the better light there. And yes, I did almost pour that on myself, so you're welcome. I will say I think the tea is more fragrant once it has actually been steeped. But what's also interesting is I think that you lose some of those more floral notes that I said that I was smelling potentially out of the actual dry leaf. So let's give it a taste. I don't really get any citrus notes. I think the Assam tea is probably way more dominant because I get a lot more of that almost kind of bittery, and I guess that must be that malty flavor. I've never really understood what malty is as far as a flavor profile, just for the notes. But it's definitely bold. It's very, very much at the forefront of my mouth kind of thing. It doesn't really move or anything like that. There's not a lot of different notes as I think about the finish of the tea. It's just pretty much bold right there, punch you and grab you with that black tea kind of flavor. I do think once you, like with other things that you might taste, once you actually get it over the coating of your mouth and get past that initial taste, you do start to get different kinds of notes. So it's not quite as musky, malty. Once it actually like settles in the mouth, it becomes a little more, I don't know how to describe it, but it becomes a little more subdued and kind of starts, I think, to want to pull some more almost floral notes forward. Again, I don't really taste super floral notes. I mostly I drink this and I think black tea. This is absolutely one that I will, when I finish out my little canister here, I will actually add cream and sugar to, and probably, consume it with a scone or something. Have a nice little British tea moment with it. I think that would actually be very lovely with this tea. Again, it's not bad on its own, but it's definitely one that I want to see what other flavors I can pull out of it with that cream and that sugar addition. So where this ranks as far as the teas I've had so far, I will actually probably put it right above the Silk Dragon Jasmine tea, which means that this particular Assam tea is my new number 5. Silk Jasmine moves down to number 6. But it's, everything's going pretty well. And again, none of these teas are really that bad. I will drink any single one of them. There are just a few that I would be disappointed to drink. So I hope that you learned something and that you have a really wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow when we do begin that final week countdown.